Eventually, they listened and took him to the police station, and she went along. And at the police station, he was at the point where he was now vomiting on the floor. And she begged them to take him to the hospital, which they eventually did, but only after having told her she must clean up her son's vomit from the floor. He went to the hospital that night and was misdiagnosed because the beating had resulted in his stomach being ruptured. But he was sent home with aspirin, painkillers, and given an appointment for the Monday after the weekend to come back to the psychiatric clinic because he had this mental health problem. He was suffering over the weekend. Miss Jenny was trying to put together the money to take him to a private doctor. And on the Monday, he and his sister went back to the public hospital for the psychiatric appointment, clinic appointment. And they sat in the waiting area for hours, to the point where he was now vomiting fecal matter, went into convulsions, and actually died there. The community had a protest, and one of the early members of JFJ stopped, spoke to them, and suggested that the family come to Jamaicans for Justice. And it was part of bringing that case to the public attention that I heard this on the radio. And I remember listening and thinking, I have a son. My son is in his teens. I cannot imagine what a mother must go through to have had that experience. And, you know, this isn't the Jamaica that I want to continue. I don't want this to be the way that a mother has to experience living in our country. And I committed to going to the next meeting, and I've never left. Yeah.
Yeah. I think a number of issues come out of this, because one is that it's individual commitment, but Susan's commitment, but before that, Miss Jenny's commitment, Miss Jenny Cameron, to stand up for justice. And I think for the early members, always there was a voice, you imagine your son is beaten to death in front of you. And the voice said, no, we don't want vengeance. We want justice. We want people to see Michael. We want them not to be able to do this to somebody again. I don't want vengeance. I want justice. And I think for me, that has been the recurring theme of our work, is the integrity of the mothers, occasionally fathers, but usually mothers, who come to us because something dreadful has happened to their children. Usually at the hands of the police, sometimes at the hands of the soldiers. And they, for the most part, are not asking for vengeance. They don't want to pick up the M16 and blow away everybody around them. What they want is justice. And they find that strong voice, and many of them have different coping mechanisms. Mm-hmm. We have a mother, Monica Williams, who's a good friend now, whose 15-year-old son was killed by police. And she was away. She was working in the States. And so she got a phone call that said, come home. And she said, why? And they said, Jason's sick. Come home. And they wouldn't tell her what, just come home. And so she came home the first flight next morning. But the whole time, they wouldn't tell her what was happening. And they live in Spanish Town. And the whole way over, her brother's driving her home. And she says, what is wrong with Jason? What is happening? And said, it's all right, but just get home. We will see him. He's in hospital. And she said when they passed the gates of Spanish Town Hospital, she knew, and she started to scream. And they had killed him. And they'd killed him because he was riding on a bicycle, he and his friend, and it had no lights. So when they saw the police car coming, instead of stopping, what they did was run. And they ran, and they chased him into a stall, a market stall, and they beat him. And then they shot him, and he died. And at the end of it, they picked up a bag, black scandal bag, with banana chips and a bottle of water, which was what they'd gone to the gas station to purchase. And Monica says to this day she can't eat banana chips. And every year, Monica holds a memorial on the anniversary of Jason's death. And she just gets people together, and she puts a notice in the papers to mark his death. And she calls her friends, and sometimes if she can, she gets a marching band, and usually she tries for the police youth band. And she goes to the spot where they killed him, and she lights candles, and then she marches through the town to remember her son. And all of our mothers have different coping mechanisms, different ways of coping with the betrayal that the death of their children at the hands of the state is. That horrible betrayal of all your hopes for your kids, but also of your place in this world and of how you see yourself and your family.
And I think that in terms of the mothers, this, I mean, as Carolyn says, this is one of, for me, the most powerful things that keeps me in this work is the courage of these women. I mentioned Miss Jenny Cameron. Having buried her son, the following morning she comes out of her house into the yard to see a group of soldiers and police, guns drawn, now pointed at the heads of her two younger sons. And again, this was intimidation, an act of intimidation to try to get her to shut up, to go no further, to forget it. And this is a recurrent theme for many of these families is, so this has happened to you, be quiet, all right? It's in your best interest to forget it, to be silent. I call it the call to silence. And it's a call to silence in Jamaica that is very strong. And it can come from a fear of that level of physical violence and threat, which many of the families experience. But it can also come in many other ways throughout the society. The threat of victimization, loss of contracts, loss of promotion. So in a variety of ways, people are afraid to speak out. And if we keep continuing that call to silence, we end up in a worse and worse situation.
Yeah, so yeah, we have to take the inspiration where it comes. And so one other case I want to speak about is Miss Elaine Johnson. Happy Henry, her son, was killed in 1998 in the stadium at a football match by a policeman in front of thousands of people. Thousands. It took 12 years for the coroner's inquest to finish. And the coroner's inquest is like a preliminary, the very first beginning stage, going to a grand jury with facts for them to rule on. It took 12 years to finish. And Miss Elaine Johnson, I don't think she missed one court date. Mm-hmm. And every time she went, how she contains her pain is she crochets. So she sits in the back of the court and she crochets. And she just crochets. And she's given us a lot of crochet over the last 10 years. But Miss Johnson was there. And she was steadfast. And last year, coroner's jury ruled that a policeman was to be charged with murder in Hapeet's death. And we were really proud of her, really proud of that family. And it takes a lot of courage because when you do the statistics, last year in Jamaica, 320 persons were killed at the hands of the police. If you compare that, it would mean that person per person in America, it would mean that the police were killing 32,000 people in a year. Imagine that. And that doesn't include the 73 who were killed in Tivoli during the state of emergency. So actually, if you add that in, you're looking at closer to 400 people killed by the police. 1 in 5 persons who died last year violently in Jamaica died at the hands of the security forces. And actually, too, this might be a good time to show them the video, which actually highlights one of those cases and is the story of one of those who died in Tivoli last year.